I guarded Prince Edward for over a decade, long enough to learn the difference between how a royal is seen and how a royal is managed. To the public, he was the spare who never became anything, the son who stayed in the background, the one the palace could afford to treat as optional. People used kinder words when they were being polite, quiet words when they were being cruel. But inside those walls, the truth was colder than either version. Prince Edward was not ignored because he was unimportant. He was treated as unimportant because it made the machinery easier to run. The palace prefers predictable hierarchies. The heir is essential. The spare is a risk. The youngest can become a complication if he ever starts to believe he deserves space. So they made sure he never did. When I first met him in the private corridors, it was not during a grand state occasion. It was during the ordinary hours, when the building breathes differently, when doors close and voices drop. He walked with a kind of caution that did not match his title. Not fear exactly, something closer to awareness. The awareness of a man who knows he is being measured even when no one is looking. The awareness of someone who has spent years hearing jokes that were not really jokes. The public never saw that part. They saw him smiling at engagements, standing a fraction behind, looking agreeable, looking safe. They assumed that was his nature. They assumed he preferred it. They assumed he had no appetite for anything more. That assumption was the palace's greatest success, because there was a version of Prince Edward the cameras rarely caught. A version that listened too carefully when officials spoke around him. A version that noticed which names were said with respect and which names were said with dismissal. A version that asked questions and then learned quickly which questions were allowed and which questions were considered a kind of disobedience. In my line of work, you learn the small signs of rank that people pretend do not exist. Who gets briefed first? Who receives the real schedule and who receives the polite version? Who is invited into the room before the decision and who is called afterward so they can be informed that a decision has already been made? Prince Edward often arrived after the decision. It was never announced as punishment. It was framed as efficiency, as tradition, as the natural order of things. But I watched it happen so many times that the pattern became impossible to deny. He was not being prepared. He was being placed, and the most damaging part was not the placement itself. It was the way the institution made him feel, as if wanting more would be embarrassing, as if ambition, in his case, would be tasteless. Over the years, I saw him absorb that lesson with a discipline that looked like humility from the outside. But up close, it did not look like humility. It looked like containment. There is a moment I still remember, small enough that it would never appear in a biography, but sharp enough that it never left me. A senior figure offered him praise that sounded generous. Then came the final phrase, said softly, almost affectionate, the kind of phrase that tells you exactly where you belong. Prince Edward smiled, thanked them, and waited until the corridor was empty before his expression changed. Not anger, not heartbreak, something quieter, something like confirmation. That was the moment I understood the real story was not about whether the public took him seriously. The real story was that the palace had decided, early on, that seriousness would be reserved for others. If you want the public version, this is a tale about a lesser royal who found a comfortable role and stayed there. If you want the private version, it is a tale about an institution that prefers a man underestimated, because an underestimated man is easier to control. And the longer I stood near him, the more I realized something that would sound unfair to say out loud. Prince Edward was not the problem the palace could not solve. He was the solution the palace never wanted to acknowledge. People believed Prince Edward lacked drive, that he was content to remain in the margins, that if he had wanted influence, he would have reached for it. Inside the palace, that interpretation was convenient. It allowed the institution to present his position as a personal choice rather than a structural outcome. What the public never understood was how early that narrative was assigned to him. Long before adulthood, long before duty could even be defined, expectations had already narrowed. In private conversations, his name was often paired with words like suitable and steady. They sounded complimentary, but they were limits disguised as praise. Suitable meant non-disruptive. Steady meant unlikely to challenge anyone else's importance. Prince Edward the Palace has a way of rewarding certain instincts while quietly discouraging others. Curiosity is tolerated in heirs. Initiative is admired in those being prepared for the highest roles. But in someone like Prince Edward, those same instincts were treated as unnecessary, not forbidden, simply redirected until they softened. I watched this happen through briefings that arrived late or arrived stripped of context, through meetings where he was present but never decisive, through moments where his suggestions were acknowledged politely and then set aside without explanation. To an outsider, it would look like disinterest on his part. To someone standing nearby, it looked like training. Not training for leadership, but training for restraint. The public also assumed he was shielded from pressure because he was not central to the crown. In reality, the pressure was different, not lighter. He carried the burden of being visible without being vital, of representing continuity without shaping it. That kind of role requires a particular kind of discipline, one that rarely earns recognition. There were days when he followed every instruction perfectly and still seemed faintly out of place. Not because he failed, but because the institution never quite decided what success would look like for him. When success has no clear shape, the safest option is compliance. And compliance, over time, can be mistaken for lack of ambition. What the public got wrong was not his capability. It was the assumption that the palace ever intended to measure it properly. He was assessed against a future that was never meant to be his, compared to standards designed for others, then quietly judged for not exceeding them. In private, there was a constant effort to remain agreeable, not because he was naturally passive, but because disagreeing carried consequences that were never written down. Consequences like exclusion, like being treated as an inconvenience rather than a contributor. Over time, he learned which version of himself was welcomed and which version caused discomfort. That is how misunderstandings become permanent. Not through scandal, not through failure, but through repetition. Through years of seeing the same image reflected back at you until it feels easier to accept it than to fight it. From the outside, Prince Edward appeared unremarkable. From the inside, he was remarkably constrained. There were habits no one outside the palace ever associated with him, not because they were dramatic, but because they disrupted the story people preferred to tell. In private settings, away from formal engagements, Prince Edward paid attention in a way that surprised those who underestimated him. He listened more than he spoke, not out of insecurity, but calculation. When you are rarely invited to lead, you learn to observe the structure instead. I saw how carefully he navigated rooms where rank was invisible but absolute. He knew who could afford to joke and who could not. He noticed which silences were comfortable and which were dangerous. This was not instinctive deference. It was learned behavior, shaped by years of subtle correction. Years of watching others speak freely while he chose precision. There was also a private discipline the public never saw. He prepared thoroughly for engagements that were considered minor. He read more than required, asked questions that never made it into official summaries. He understood that visibility without authority can be unforgiving. One misstep would confirm every quiet assumption already attached to his name. What struck me most was how rarely frustration surfaced, not because it was absent, but because it had been trained into something quieter. In moments when others might have pushed back, he paused. When suggestions were dismissed, he noted it and moved on. This restraint was often mistaken for indifference. In truth, it was adaptation. Silence inside the palace is rarely neutral. It can be loyalty. It can be caution. It can be a form of survival. In his case, silence became a tool. He learned when to speak just enough to be useful, and when to disappear just enough to avoid becoming a problem. That balance is exhausting, though no one ever calls it labor. There were private exchanges that revealed a sharper awareness than anyone credited him for. Observations about hierarchy, about how narratives are maintained, about which roles are truly flexible and which are fixed long before anyone admits it. He never framed these thoughts as complaints. He stated them as facts. That alone told me he had accepted the rules, even if he had not written them. The side never meant to be seen was not a man longing for rebellion. It was a man who understood the limits placed upon him and chose stability over resistance. That choice earned him safety, but it also erased complexity. The palace values calm continuity. It does not reward those who reveal its contradictions too clearly. From the outside, his life appeared uncomplicated. From within, it was carefully managed simplicity, a version of himself shaped to fit an institutional need rather than personal potential. And that is the part the public never considered. That invisibility can be assigned. That quiet can be engineered. That some royals are not forgotten by accident. They are placed exactly where the system needs them to be. The palace did not treat Prince Edward as a problem. That is an important distinction. Problems attract attention. They demand correction. What the palace saw in him was something more manageable, a variable that could be contained without confrontation. The conflict was never loud. It unfolded quietly, through procedure, through omission, through expectations that were never written down but always enforced. The system values continuity above all else. Continuity depends on clarity of hierarchy. Everyone must know their place, not just publicly, but internally. Prince Edward's place was defined early, and once defined, It was protected from disruption. Any attempt to expand it would have required the institution to explain why it had been so narrowly drawn in the first place. I watched moments where the person and the system briefly came into tension, not through defiance, but through initiative, a suggestion that implied growth, a willingness to take responsibility beyond what was customary. Each time the response was calm, courteous, and final. The system did not argue. It redirected. It reminded. It closed ranks. Control in the palace rarely looks like refusal. It looks like guidance, like concern, like protecting someone from unnecessary exposure. Prince Edward was often told that certain roles were not suitable for him, not because he lacked ability, but because the role required a different kind of presence, a presence already reserved for someone else. What the system failed to recognize was that restraint, repeated long enough, becomes friction. Not the kind that sparks rebellion, but the kind that dulls initiative. Over time, the conflict resolved itself in the only way the palace truly prefers. The individual adapted. The structure remained unchanged. There were no dramatic confrontations, no doors slammed, no ultimatums. The conflict was resolved through patience, through endurance, through the quiet understanding that pushing harder would only confirm the very doubts that surrounded him. So he chose consistency, reliability, a version of duty that asked for little and demanded even less. From the outside, this looks like harmony. Inside, it is something else entirely. It is a system asserting its boundaries without ever naming them. It is a person learning where those boundaries are and deciding consciously not to test them again. Prince Edward did not lose this conflict in any visible way. He fulfilled his role. He avoided scandal. He preserved dignity. But the cost of that resolution was subtle. The system remained intact, but the space for personal definition narrowed further. What could have evolved was stabilized instead. That is how the crown maintains itself. Not by breaking people, but by shaping them until resistance feels unnecessary. History will remember Prince Edward as a dependable figure, a royal who caused no difficulty, a man who accepted his position and carried it without complaint. In institutional terms, that is success. The crown values endurance more than transformation. It rewards those who do not require adjustment from the system itself. But standing close to him for so many years, I saw what that version of success quietly erased. What was lost was not ambition in the obvious sense. It was possibility. The chance for the institution to recognize that seriousness does not always announce itself loudly. That capability can exist without spectacle. The public never debated his role because there was nothing dramatic to debate. No rupture, no scandal, no visible defiance. And so the narrative settled. The palace never took him seriously, and in doing so ensured the public never would either. That judgment became self-sustaining. Repeated often enough, it no longer needed explanation. There is a particular loneliness in being trusted, but not relied upon, in being present, but not essential. Prince Edward occupied that space with remarkable composure. He learned how to serve without expectation, how to represent without shaping, how to remain useful without becoming influential. Those are not small skills. They are simply undervalued ones. The crown endured, as it always does. The hierarchy remained clear. The roles stayed intact. But something quieter never returned. the chance to allow a different kind of seriousness, one that does not compete for attention, but earns it over time. One that could have broadened the institution rather than threatening it. Those who stood closest understand this distinction. We do not speak of regret, because regret suggests a mistake that could have been avoided. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. Made early, maintained carefully, defended politely. Prince Edward did not fail the system. The system succeeded exactly as designed. And yet, when I think back on those years, what lingers is not the smoothness of that success, but the narrowness of it. History will record stability. Those who watched from the corridor will remember restraint. The crown moved forward unchanged. Something human remained contained.